Edmonton.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on Bill C-76, an act to amend the Canada Elections Act. There is no shortage of criticism that can be made of this deeply flawed piece of legislation, but given the limited time that I have, I'm going to confine my remarks to the issue of foreign funding, foreign influence, and foreign interference in our elections. The sanctity and the integrity of our elections and the integrity of our democracy depends on Canadians and Canadians alone determining the outcome of elections without the interference of foreigners. This is something that Canadians have taken for granted, and indeed, historically, our elections have not had outside forces, outside influence, interfering and attempting to influence Canadian voters. But, Mr. Speaker, that has changed, and there was a drastic change in the lead-up to the 2015 election. During the 2015 election, there were various foreign entities, largely U.S.-based, radical, anti-oil sands organizations who had the express purpose of wanting to see Canadian energy kept in the ground, just like Gerald Butts, the Prime Minister's principal secretary, who also wants to see our energy kept in the ground, funneled a lot of money to registered third parties who then, in turn, used those foreign monies to promote the Liberal Party of Canada and to work to defeat the Conservative government of the day. Mr. Speaker, we are talking about millions and millions of dollars that were funneled from the U.S. to registered third parties. For example, the Tides Foundation funneled $1.5 million. Of that $1.5 million, about $700,000 was transferred to a Canadian shell entity based out of British Columbia that in turn sent the money to Lead Now, which of course worked very closely with the Liberal Party during the last election. Another $700,000 or so of the Tides money was transferred directly to 8 registered third parties. And the Tides Foundation, Mr. Speaker, was hardly the only example. There were many, many U.S. sources of funding that went to a number of third-party groups that were active during the 2015 election. Now, in light of that kind of influence and interference, I think a lot of Canadians might scratch their heads and say, how is it possible? How is it possible that millions of U.S. dollars rolled into registered third parties, and these third parties were able to use that money for all manner of political purposes during the 2015 election and get away with it? Well, the answer, Mr. Speaker, is largely because of loopholes that exist in the Canada Elections Act. Perhaps the biggest loophole in the Canada Elections Act provides that there is no regulation whatsoever of foreign monies funneled to registered third parties 6 months and a day prior to the issuance of a writ. Those monies can be transferred to a third party, and then the third party is free to use them for political purposes to directly influence Canadian voters. So, for example, if a foreign entity 6 months and a day, transferred $1 million to a registered Canadian third party, those monies would be treated as having mingled into the funds of that third party. And that third party would be free to use it. Those dollars would be treated as though they were Canadian dollars, notwithstanding the fact that they clearly came from a foreign source. Now, Mr. Speaker, what does Bill C-76 do to close this massive loophole? You know what the answer is, Mr. Speaker? Absolutely nothing. It does absolutely nothing to close this loophole. It leaves it wide open. It's free rein for foreign interests and foreigners to come in and influence the next election. But to the degree anything has changed, they've made the situation worse. This government, Mr. Speaker, has made the situation worse because under the existing Canada Elections Act, the period that is regulated is 6 months prior to the issue of a writ. Under this legislation, the pre-election period that will be completely unregulated goes up to June 30th. So, in other words, it's going to be closer to the election that foreign interests can donate to third parties. And of course, this government has doubled the amount that third parties can spend during the election and has provided that they may spend $1 million in the pre-election period. Foreign money, Mr. Speaker, free to do so. They can simply transfer it over, Mr. Speaker. It's really quite astonishing. And while we can blame the foreign interests and the third parties that have taken advantage of loopholes in the Canada Elections Act, there's another culprit. It's called the Liberal Party of Canada, which actively collaborated with third parties that were taking these foreign monies. And I believe the Liberal Party had all the information available to them that they knew this was taking place, and they turned a blind eye to it, Mr. Speaker. And now, Mr. Speaker, under the guise of pretending to do something about foreign influence and foreign interference in elections, the Liberals are saying it's A-OK just as long as you donate the money before June 30th. Third parties are free to take as much foreign money as possible. And while it's bad enough that we had U.S. money, large amounts of U.S. money during the last election, who's to say, Mr. Speaker, that in the 2019 election it won't be Saudi money or Chinese money or Russian money, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, Canadians should be alarmed and they should be outraged. And quite frankly, Canadians deserve better from this government. Canadians deserve elections that are free from foreign influence and foreign interference. And instead of doing that, what Bill C-76 does is it maintains a loophole, it legitimizes this, it sanitizes this, Mr. Speaker, for the sake of the integrity of our elections and for the sake of our democracy. Bill C-76 needs to be defeated out of hand.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Kingston and the Islands.
When I heard the member opposite say absolutely nothing a couple times, I was reminded of what the previous Conservative government had done to strengthen democracy in Canada, which was absolutely nothing. But my question to the member, and he talked about the opportunity for third parties and money being generated by third parties, and I've heard it because I've been in the House for the majority of the day to listen to the debate. I've heard this come up quite a bit. So my question is to the member, what does he propose? What would he do? What legislation would he bring in to actually prevent this from occurring?
Honourable member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Mr. Speaker, the legislation could be very simply amended to prohibit foreign funding and to regulate this kind of money coming in. But the government is not interested in doing that. We learned today that, in fact, the Prime Minister has ordered Elections Canada to move forward with Bill C-76 as written. So this government is not interested in amendments. They're not interested in fixing the problems with this bill. They're prepared to ram it through with their usual contempt of this House. And, Mr. Speaker, under the guise of pretending to do something about foreign interference and foreign influence, Mr. Speaker, they're giving it the green light, probably because they recognize that it benefited the Liberal Party during the last election, and they're hoping they can get away with it one more time.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for South Okanagan, West Kootenay.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech. I just wondered if he would comment on the provisions in this bill that would once again allow the Chief Electoral Officer, Elections Canada, to inform and educate Canadians about the electoral system, something that was taken away in the fair elections, the so-called Fair Elections Act that the Conservatives brought in 2014. And, you know, many Canadians thought this was an egregious, attempt to, keep Canadians ignorant. Why should we not want to educate Canadians about our electoral system that is at the heart of our democracy?
Member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
I thank the member for West Kootenay, South Okanagan, and Mr. Speaker, I know the honourable member referred to unfairness, and we've heard Liberal members talk about unfairness. I'll tell you, Mr. Speaker, what is unfair, and what is unfair is seeing millions and millions of dollars of foreign money funneled into registered third parties who have used those monies to try to influence how Canadians vote. And, Mr. Speaker, that is a loophole that absolutely needs to be closed, and we are not going to back down. We're going to keep up the pressure in defense of the integrity of our elections and in defense of the integrity of our democracy.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Barrie Innisfil.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my honourable colleague for his speech on this. And as always in this House, he speaks passionately and certainly with a lot of knowledge. One of the issues that is increasingly concerning, and I know he spent a lot of time on this, was the aspect of foreign influence. Now, the cynic in me says that because the Conservative Party of Canada is able to fundraise, as we saw in the last quarter, 2 times the amount of the Liberal Party. Does the member believe that the reason why they're not dealing with this foreign influence of money coming in and ripping democracy out of the hands of Canadians is because of the Liberals' ineptitude, their inability to raise funds, Mr. Speaker? Thank you.
Honourable member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think the honourable member for Barrie Innisfil is exactly right. And what it's also about is creating an uneven playing field. It's all about rigging the system as much as possible to benefit the Liberal Party. So they're going to open up and maintain a loophole, expand the loophole for foreign financing under the guise of doing something. They're then trying to impose restrictions on political parties in terms of how much money they can spend during the pre-writ period, all the while ministers can continue to freely travel, the government can continue to advertise, Mr. Speaker, all to the benefit of the Liberal Party, Mr. Speaker. But, I guess desperate measures are needed in desperate times, and for the Liberal Party, looking at their last fundraising quarter, $3 million to $6 million for us, it's pretty desperate over